Beverly, we don't hear you. You, you are muted.
Sorry, I was asking like, where are we live in Facebook?
Yes, we are now live in Facebook.
We are live in Facebook now.
We're going to ask our speakers to turn on their camera for the whole duration of the program. We will wait for Mr. Palab and then we'll start. Okay, so good day and we welcome you back, everyone, to another educational discussion that is part of the Education Series on People's Resistance in South Asia, running from the month of November to December. I am Diwa from the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation, or IPMSDL, and will host this program. So thank you for joining us today. Just a quick plug that we are live streaming on Facebook, on the Facebook page of IPMSDL. And questions for this program will go into the Q&A box of this Zoom. In the Facebook, you can comment it, or private message for those who are a little bit shy to send in their comments. As early as now, you can actually send in preliminary questions or maybe expectations of what you hope to learn or hear more about in the next hour or so with regard to the topic. So as the title of our webinar suggests, Andolon, ebong, songhati, if I pronounced it correctly, or the Indigenous Peoples Movement and Solidarity in Bangladesh. Today we'll get to know more about the Indigenous peoples of Bangladesh, a bit of history and background, leading to contemporary issues and challenges. And of course, the resistance that arises in such conditions in relation to assertion of the rights to land, resources that are all enshrined in the universal right of indigenous peoples to self-determination. This discussion is also timely as we anticipate the 23rd anniversary of the CHT, or the Chittagong Hill Tract Accord, this coming December. We have yet to hear significant developments on the rights and welfare of the indigenous peoples, both in the hills and the plains of Bangladesh, since the signing of this agreement. So today, we are also joined by our partner organizations, the Bangladesh Indigenous Women's Network, Bangladesh Indigenous Peoples Forum, Parbatya, Chattagram, Jana, Samhati, Samiti, or PCJSS, and the Kapaeeng Foundation. So to open our discussion, I'll be handing it over to Mr. Palab Shakma, the Executive Director of Kapaeeng Foundation, a human rights organization of indigenous peoples of Bangladesh. Thank you, Palab.
Thank you. And I welcome you all, my colleagues, panelists, and the viewers. On behalf of IPMSDL, Bangladesh Indigenous Peoples Forum, Kapaeeng Foundation, PCJSS, and Bangladesh Indigenous Women Network, we would like to warmly welcome you all in our today's discussion. As my colleague already mentioned about today's discussion topic, as we will hear something on indigenous people's struggle, their situation in Bangladesh. So if we discuss we indigenous people in Bangladesh are not recognized constitutionally, so still our struggle for identity, our own indigenous identity is going on. On the other hand, our land rights are being violated by state forces and non-state actors. So as usual, we also face discrimination, land grabbing, and government projects are being implemented on indigenous territories. So government are declaring indigenous people land as protected areas, reserve forest, and they are implementing projects on indigenous territories. So, for example, the eco park, national park. So this is how they are grabbing the land of indigenous people, and indigenous people are forced to evict from their traditional land. On the other hand, military camps are also expanding, and this is how they are also constructing or establishing their tourism in the land of indigenous people. That's why we are having problem with we are losing our traditional land. So this is all our challenges. On the other hand, if we see the issues of violence against indigenous women, and indigenous women's rights are being violated across the country, and this is very frustrating that as a human rights organization, we every year we produce human rights report of indigenous people, and when we produce the report of violence against indigenous women, the data and information we collect, we get from across the country, this is very frustrating. And the issue of culture of impunity is very alarming. So this is all challenges. I think my colleague who are presenting the presentation on a specific topic, they will cover all these things broadly. And the issue of human rights violations, also a big issue for us right at this moment. Even in this pandemic situation, we indigenous people of Chittagong Hill Tracts and also plainland people who are suffering from different kinds of discrimination and also criminalizations of the activists who are defending their rights, who are protecting their land, they are targeted and they are criminalized by the state and non-state actors. And the torture, intimidation, extrajudicial killing, all this also, we are also experiencing all these things. So on the other hand, if we see the participation and engagement in the processes of sustainable development goals, we are already passing the 5th year of sustainable development goals, but still now we do not see the proper engagement of indigenous peoples. As we know, the theme of the SDG is leave no one behind, but as marginalized groups of the society, indigenous people are the poorer of the poor, but our voices are not heard, our concerns are not raised, and our engagement are not ensured as of now. So all these critical issues will be discussed later on, and I think we could bring all these issues properly, and our audience will know better. They will better understand the situation of indigenous people in Bangladesh. So on behalf of all the organizations, I would like to warmly welcome you all again in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Palabji, for running us through what we'll be hearing about in the next hour. So we truly hope that this discussion does not only contribute to raising awareness, but more importantly, mobilizing us to support the struggle and be in strong solidarity with the indigenous peoples of Bangladesh. Now, to further introduce us to the indigenous peoples of Bangladesh, let us hear an overview of their situation from Mr. Sanjeev Trong, the General Secretary of the Bangladesh Indigenous Peoples Forum, also an editor and columnist, and an expert member of the Parliamentary Caucus on Indigenous Peoples. So, Mr. Sanjeev, over to you.
Thank you, Diwa. Will I start now?
Yes, you may.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pallab, Chakma, Beverly, Raja Devashish Rai, and other colleagues. A very good morning from Bangladesh. I thank IPMSDL DL. Very nice, again, very strong name, I think. Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation. Very strong for us, for Bangladeshi people. Right to self-determination, and even you added liberation. I'm happy that we are, jointly having this discussion today on Bangladesh, indigenous peoples of Bangladesh, situation of indigenous peoples. I will be very brief. It's a big issue, but I think my colleagues, Raja Devashish Roy, Chanchana Chakma, and Pallab Chakma will add more in this discussion. So, in Bangladesh, like I think indigenous peoples in many countries, as United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues also sometimes publishes some documents. Indigenous peoples face also in Bangladesh a historical discrimination. Even before the colonization, indigenous peoples had enjoyed their rights in their own areas, own territories. Even in the British regime, after events 1757. So the same situation we are facing also, like historical discrimination, injustice, and violation of human rights. Land grabbing, as my colleague Pallab Chakma mentioned, very serious land grabbing is here, and sometimes we face direct attack, like indigenous peoples faced direct attack from the influential groups, majority communities, corporations, companies. Mainly the corporations and companies get support from government, powerful political parties, like that. Yeah, indigenous peoples are the poorest of the poor also here in Bangladesh. They face different kind of discrimination, even double discriminations, triple discrimination sometimes. As indigenous peoples, as they live in the remote areas, in the forest, in the hills, in the mountains, in the periphery, and also they face discrimination as their minority, religious minority, also ethnic minority, or national minority, or linguistic minority. They face militarization is a big issue here, mainly in the Chittagong hill tracts. Bangladesh got independence almost 50 years now, from 1971, and the people, the original people, indigenous peoples in the Chittagong hill tracts, have been facing almost 40, 45 years, militarization under the military rules. There's a democracy in other side, the rest of the country, but only this Chittagong hill tract, 3 districts, almost more than 4 decades, they're under militarization. Lack of recognition and respect for basic rights and freedom as indigenous peoples. Their like languages, cultures, way of life, customary rights to the land, ancestral rights to the land, or traditional rights to the land, not recognized. Indigenous peoples have been living on their land for generations before the British, before the colonialism. Then it was independent, and we became the citizen of East Pakistan, and then now Bangladesh. But the ancestral rights to the land, customary rights to the land, mostly unrecognized. That's why we are saying that they're facing respect of indigenous peoples face lack of respect for basic rights and freedom. And then who are indigenous peoples here? I put the map here. This is Bangladesh. In the north, you see the Assam, India. I come from there. Garo, Hajong, and almost 10 indigenous peoples live there. And the other side, my community Garo live in Meghalaya, India. They are better, I think. They're enjoying better rights in Meghalaya, like greater autonomous or self-rules there. At the moment in Meghalaya, the chief minister is Garo, and in the north, North Bengal, and in the west, also India, and the also east side, India, Tripura, and the other side, Bay of Bengal and Myanmar. So we are surrounded by almost India. And we say who are indigenous peoples in Bangladesh? Government recognized last year only, 2019, last year in March. The previous, I think previous slide, Diva. Yeah, no, there was another one. Who are indigenous peoples? Missing, I think. I don't know. Okay. Yeah. This is yes. The government recognized 50 indigenous communities, indigenous peoples last year in 2019. Government recognized 27 in 2010. But we indigenous peoples were saying that there are more than 50 indigenous communities for long. But now, from 2019, Government Cultural Ministry recognized 50 indigenous communities. Government included my name in that committee for listing these indigenous groups, because in 2010, government only included 27 indigenous communities in Bangladesh, and in that 27, 3 names were wrong. It was repeated or double. So there were only 24, and then there was a committee, expert committee by the ministry, and I was there in the committee, and we did some research and field visit, and then finally government recognized 50 communities last year, 2019. So we can say that government recognized 50 indigenous peoples. They sometimes use ethnic community terminology or like small anthropological group like that. In Bengali, it's called Khudro Nigosti, but who are this small ethnic group? If we say in that act, it is said that those who are listed in the what you call annexure or appendix or what you call this called attachment, you can say, they are indigenous peoples. So it is there, recognition is there as indigenous peoples also. But there are government some notice that you cannot say use the word indigenous peoples. So there are mixed, even conflicts among the government, even in many documents. So we say estimated population of indigenous peoples in Bangladesh is 4 million, but we don't have that kind of disaggregated data by the government. Only we have indigenous population, number of indigenous population we get segregated like Garo, Chakma, Marma, like that. Only for 27, they said 1.6 million in 2011. But that 1.6 million is only for that 27 communities, but it is now doubled. Then we can easily imagine that indigenous population will be at least more than 3 million in Bangladesh. But we claim indigenous peoples, we are more than 4 million population. We represent 39 indigenous languages in Bangladesh. Like here, Chakma, Marma, I am Garo. Bangladesh established International Mother Language Institution. In 1999, our Prime Minister was awarded by UNESCO Peace Award. And then Bangladesh government decided to establish International Mother Language Institution, and they made commitment, they promised that they will work for preservation of all endangered or all mother languages in this world. So they made a study, and I was also in the committee. So now there are 41 languages in Bangladesh. In that 41, one is Bangla and one is Urdu. The Pakistanis who stayed here after 1971, so their language is Urdu. Then if we exclude Urdu and Bangla, then 39 indigenous languages we use. There are Chakma and Marma that I said, and the next, yes, the government positions. We had there was an amendment, constitutional amendment in 2011, and then government made big changes in the constitution. They even made amendment of election system, even caretaker government system. They cancelled that. So there was a chance for also indigenous peoples. We made some advocacy that this is the chance for inclusion of indigenous peoples in the constitution. Before 2011, it was not. It was mentioned nothing about indigenous or tribal or whatever it is. It was like all citizens are equal before law, like that. Or the constitution can take special measures for backward section of the population. It was like backward section of the population. Okay, it may mean, yeah, backward section means indigenous people, but nothing was there before 2011. Then in 2011, when constitutional committee was formed, and they had several meetings, and I was invited in the parliament. I think I was only from indigenous community invited in the parliament. And before the committee, I submitted written, what they call demands, kind of demands, how we indigenous peoples want to see the inclusion of indigenous peoples in the constitution. It was a good meeting, but finally they didn't accept my points. And when constitution was amended constitution was passed in June, like 30 June 2011. So government included one chapter, like the state will preserve and protect the local unique cultures of the tribes, minor races, ethnic sects, and communities. It was there. Some people say that, yeah, okay, government didn't recognize you as indigenous, but you are recognized as tribes, minor races, ethnic sects, and communities, like that. But there was another problem. There was Article 6. This was Article 23A, but they added new articles or sub-articles. 6A, they said the citizen of Bangladesh, no, the people of Bangladesh shall be known as Bengalis. This was a great mistake, or big problem, because we are people, we are Garos, we are Chakmas, we are not Bengalis. So this kind of contradiction is there in the constitution. For the plainland indigenous peoples, maybe here you, the people of IPMSDL, you know very well the Chittagong Hill Tracts. But I think I should say that the majority of indigenous peoples in Bangladesh, they live outside Chittagong Hill Tracts. But in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, they have the history of long struggle, and they are concentrated in that area. But in the plain land, we the indigenous peoples live scattered, in many places. And we become minority already, almost many years ago, or more than 40, 50 years ago. So we have only this law, State Acquisition and Tenancy Act, 1950. But this law came from the British regime. It was British, then Pakistan, and Bangladesh also adopted this law, or still following this law. We have the Chittagong Hill Tracts Peace Accord, 1997, 23 years already gone, but major commitments have not been fulfilled. I think Raja Devashish Rai Pallab Chakma will add more here. So I just put the theme or the bullet point. We have good education policy, recognize indigenous peoples, child policy, also indigenous peoples recognition is there. Women development policy, 2011, indigenous women issues are there. We have Small Ethnic Community Cultural Institution Act, I mentioned 2010. We have some other policies like forest policies, National Forest Policy, 2016. But we had also Forest Policy 1984, 1979, but now 2016 Forest Policy, still draft, I think. And we had environment policies, and there are some rules like environmental rules, social forestry rules, regulations, etc. To some extent, they included indigenous issues, but they didn't mention about the land issues in the forest. land rights of indigenous peoples in the forest areas. So these kind of problems are there. We have 5-year plan, and 5-year plan also included indigenous issues. We have SDGs, as we all know, SDG included indigenous peoples issues, and Bangladesh government also kept indigenous peoples issues, but we don't have we are not actor. We are not the part of the implementation of SDG process. As if like government is saying that government will do for indigenous peoples, or government is implementing SDGs, and also indigenous peoples will be benefited. This is the attitude. This is the mindset of the policymakers. This is a big problem. We are demanding that government should include, or government should go for partnership with indigenous peoples in the SDGs, so that indigenous peoples are also the part of the implementation of SDG process. I can show you Bangladesh is very good of publishing big books. Like if you say this book, did you see the book? Nice book. Like Voluntary National Review, very big book. And this kind of book like Revised Monitoring Evaluation Framework of Sustainable Development Goals, Bangladesh Perspective, these kind of things. And Prospect and Opportunities, international cooperation like that. You will find in the website of Bangladesh these books. This is nice, I think. They are very serious. Government is very serious about SDGs, and maybe government might be awarded. We will be happy if they are awarded. But the problem is indigenous peoples are excluded in the implementing process of this SDG implementation. Next. So this is my last issues, major issues. Unpeopling of indigenous peoples. We are almost at the risk or extinction. I forgot to tell that, the Mother Government Institute, International Mother Language Institute, found 41 languages in Bangladesh, and that government institution recognized 14 of indigenous languages almost lost, almost disappeared now, and many are endangered. So indigenous peoples in Bangladesh, they're losing their mother languages. Even according to government recognize it. Violation of human rights, lack of security, killings, threat of evictions, direct attacks, criminalization. I think Devashisda and Pallabda can add more. The criminalization, when indigenous peoples protest, human rights defenders face false cases, harassment, threats, like that. Harassment, lack of freedom of expression. This is a very big issue, freedom of expressions here. You cannot, you have to be careful now. You have ICT Act, you cannot post in your Facebook whatever you want. Maybe you might face legal cases, these issues. Land grabbing and livelihood destruction, losing our forest livelihoods, the Khasis, the Garos in Mymensingh areas, other Santals in North Bengal, even in the hill tracts, Population transfer, human rights violation, we all know. Outsiders occupying indigenous land, and minoritization. In the Chittagong hill tracts, almost like 500,000, 500,000 outsiders, they call settlers, were settled with the sponsor or support of the government on indigenous land in the Chittagong hill tracts. That population transfer made minority indigenous peoples in the hill tracts. Uncertain future. And the final one, there are some positive issues, positive trends, I must say. Government recognition and inclusion, like education in indigenous languages, 5 indigenous languages, 6 indigenous languages are recognized, and they have government books in indigenous languages. But there are problems like no teacher recruited, no policy adopted still. But at least government published 6 indigenous languages, books in 6 indigenous languages. CST accord was good. We appreciated. There was an accord, and it was, even welcomed by international communities. But almost 2 decades, more than 2 decades, 23 years, this accord almost failed now. There are some policies, special measures. Government have some special measures like welfare type of activities, like safety net program that indigenous peoples like widow, like vulnerable people, elderly people, disabled people, or poor extreme indigenous families receive some support from government, like food or sometimes cash money, etc. We have few acts in the hill tracts. We have acts, regional council act, hill district council act, like that, and there's some laws, not adequate, but still some. The good thing is civil society in Bangladesh, NGOs, media, becoming positive, I would say. They should do more, but I think these are hopeful. We have parliamentary caucus on indigenous peoples, not that strong, almost struggling, but still we have. And there are some good member of parliament. I am also there, but they are support, but they are not very strong or influential, but still they raise voices. The UN agencies here trying to do something like UNDP had a big program in the hill tracts before. UN agency ILO, but not adequate, but they have some initiatives. Development partners like European Union have some projects, or other embassies, Danish embassy, Danida, I think Sweden SIDA, this kind of the development partners positive about indigenous issues. We have made some networks, alliances, national, regional, international. Raja Devashish Rai knows about very better than me. We have some unity here now. We have Bangladesh Indigenous Peoples Forum. We don't claim that we represent all, but still we have good unity, and we are raising collective voices here, solidarity among indigenous peoples and organizations. And plainland indigenous peoples and the hill tracts indigenous peoples, we are fighting, struggling together for indigenous people's rights. I think my time gone over already. Diva, is it okay?
Yes, so if you have
15 minutes gone?
yes, it's
Thank
already.
you. Thank you very much then. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Mr. Sanjeev. That was comprehensive, and it gave us a general picture of who the indigenous peoples are in Bangladesh, what is now known as Bangladesh. And you also gave us a glimpse of the policies that are in place that are actually affecting the survival of indigenous peoples in the country. I am quite curious of how you defined unpeopling of indigenous peoples. It is the erasure of identity. If you just put in the intent, that would be short of genocide already. So we are nearing the 23rd year, as you have mentioned, of the Chittagong Hill Tract Agreement, but basic recognition has yet to be realized for the indigenous peoples. So we understand that even before the pandemic, there have been economic and political hardships for the indigenous peoples. So maybe later in the open forum, you can expound how the disposition has developed with the coming of the COVID pandemic and other crises that arose with it. All right, moving on, we look further into the land and territories now, territorial issues of the indigenous peoples of Bangladesh in the hills and the plains using the historical lens. So for that, we have now Ms. Raja Devasish Roy, the Chakma Circle Chief, and formerly a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He will be presenting on the land issues in Bangladesh, as well as the indigenous peoples movement in the country. So Raja Dev, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Diva. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Okay, I'll be talking about land issues and the indigenous peoples movement in Bangladesh. But of course, when I say land, I will also mean territories. So in different senses. Please to the next. Okay, I'll talk about 6 major things. I'll start with the introduction about the hills and the plains. Hills meaning Chittagong tracts. The historical indigenous dominance in certain territories, but this is, who writes history. We have started writing our histories. It's going on, but it's still far away from really establishing how we were dominating, how we lost that dominance. Third, well, the current status a little bit, and Sanjeev has told many things, which I don't have to address. Then the CHT Accord, the agreement in 1997, and territorial issues. Where are we? So there are some things to, I think, celebrate, but some things to condemn. And well, it's very difficult to feel happy sometimes when our next CHT Accord day is coming on 2nd December. Anyway, the De-Territorialized Plains. You just heard Diva was saying, how do you de-people a people? And how do you de-territorialize a people's territory, domain, lands? And well, where are we going with the forward? Some good practices are there. I think some good examples with which to draw inspiration from and strength from are also. It's not all lost. Okay, next. Okay, so I am saying plains, although Sanjeev Drang reminds us sometimes in his near Maman Singh area, near we have some plains as well. But anyway, we will say plains and hills, the plains and CHT. Next, please, yes. Okay, now hills, I'm just drawing the main sort of contrast between the two. Now the hills, we have some mountains, not very high like Cordilleras, but about some parts 1,000 meters, about as high as it gets. So, but they're quite rugged. But in the plains is much more plains and few smaller hills. But wherever there are indigenous peoples are there are some hills, if not always. There are even in Sundarbans, that's plains. We have indigenous people. But so IP population is concentrated in the hills, where I think overall in the hill tracts as a region, like the Cordilleras, you can say that I think we are still, indigenous people are still a majority, if you trust the census, if the census is right. But in individual districts, we have been minoritized. Now, in the plains, where Sanjeev's Garo people were once a majority in Madhupur jungle, they had like a protected status. They are now a minority. So in the hill tracts, we are more concentrated. So we now have 3 members of parliament, and in many local, not all, many local government elections, we can elect our own representatives at village to higher sub-district levels. That is not the case for the plains, except very, very few pockets of local government. And unfortunately, whilst our traditional institutions are recognized, I'm jumping to the 4th row, I think, 4th or 5th, in the plains case, it is not recognized. But it's not that they're not there. They are there. And the indigenous peoples don't go to the state courts or to the police generally, 90% of the cases. But their traditional leaders are not recognized by law, but ours are. So we have 3 tiers of chief, myself being circle chief. There are 2,000 villages in my territory. Then we have 178 sub-chiefs, and then more than between 2,500 village chiefs, of which thankfully I can say that more than a quarter now, about a quarter now, are women over the last 10, 15 years. So limited autonomy is exercised in the sense we have the regional council, the district council. We have us traditional institutions where we exercise authority over tribal courts, which is recognized by law. So we are like small magistrates. And so the district courts cannot take civil matters between indigenous peoples like inheritance, marriage, divorce. These have to come to the chief's court, but can go to the government at higher levels. And we have the councils, as we have said, by the 97 agreement, we have a regional council introduced for the first time. But on theory, that is the premier institution with all authorities supervise the administration, advise the government on legislation and so forth. But in practice, the government has not allowed that council, which is led by the Jyotirindra Bodhipriya Larma, head of the JSS, which led the movement, cannot do what it is supposed to do by law. Now, land and territorial rights are recognized in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. I have written on this in various publications. So our customary law is recognized, both personal and land law, where, for example, the district councils cannot give their consent before any land is transferred. Even the central government is not supposed to buy land or take over land in our 3 districts without the consent of the district councils. Then we have the chiefs and headmen, where the untitled lands, which are not registered, generally is regulated by the headmen at Mosa and circle levels, like shifting cultivation land, grazing lands. These are regulated by the headmen. But that is not the case in the plains, but only one of the few good things that remains in the plains is in Sanjeev's area, where an organization called the Tribal Welfare Association, that association's consent is sought before the district officer allows land sales. So this is a somewhat paternalistic remnant from the British days in like Chota Nagpur, Bengal and Jharkhand. We have the Santal and other indigenous peoples. You still have those protective laws to protect particularly indigenous peasants from losing the lands in the market. So these safeguard, that one safeguard that's there in the lands, which Sanjeev mentioned as the Bengal Tenancy Act of 1950. Now, indigenous peoples are getting more and more minoritized. In the plains, they are already minoritized. Like they can hardly muster enough population to elect a sub-district chairman or member. But in our case, at least in most, I'm saying, but losing, but not in the urban municipalities. I told the Prime Minister when we last met her, we've not been able to meet her for the last 7-8 years, that she gave a luncheon for about a few hundred chiefs along with the MPs. And we told her not a single mayor is an indigenous person. I don't know, the mayor of Baguio is indigenous or not now, but we have lost all the mayorships, 7 of them, I think, to non-indigenous people. So I was jokingly saying, thank God I don't have to stand for election. The Chakma chief will become also a non-indigenous person from Dhaka. I don't know. I hope. Next. Next, please. Okay, this just tells you, for those of you who are outside Bangladesh, where Bangladesh location is between India, Burma, or Myanmar, etc. And the picture to the right is for the Bomang Circle chief from the south, near the Burmese border. And the little boy you see is Bangladeshi Chakma boy, whose art was accepted 20 years ago, and Vicky was the chairperson of the Permanent Forum. And now the logo of the Permanent Forum is the drawing done by the little fellows sitting next to Chandra Roy, the chief of the secretariat of the Permanent Forum, but she's gonna leave the forum soon for retirement. Anyway, next please. And this is, again, just to tell you where Chittagong Hill Tracts is located. So we're not very far. We actually share borders with Chin State, which is Maithung Yumon and Suikar, and Rakhine State. There are some Rakhine friends to India, and then Mizoram, which is Indian state, the most autonomous, one of the most autonomous states in India. Then Tripura state, Sukhendu and others, etc. That's Chittagong Hill Tracts, with borders on 3 of the 4 sides of our territory. Next. Well, this is one of my dreams. Unfortunately, my training is law, but I have many friends who are historians, so I get some tips from them. I want to write the history of indigenous peoples in their territories in Bangladesh, what it was like 1,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and today. And I think that in most of the regions, except the central Dhaka, the plains, indigenous peoples were the majority. So I hope I will be able to produce a map which shows the ecological map of Bangladesh and the demographic map of Bangladesh, and obviously also the territories of the different peoples as they were historically. Next, please. So even if I give an example of the Northwest Bangladesh, which is very little known about with regard to indigenous people, there are Santal, Munda, very similar people to Jharkhand. When they, made that territory habitable by doing reforms on the earth, making, wet rice fields out of small hillocks and forests and all that, they did it much more than the Bengali-speaking people. Now you find them, they are now at the margin, losing lands. We have heard about the attacks against them, land grabbing, rape, violence against women, you name it. Now I've spoken about Madhupur to the north, in the south coast in the southwest, near the Sundarbans. You should know that there are indigenous people in the Sundarbans too, the Bengal tiger place bordering West Bengal. And then if you start from the Sundarbans and come up to near the Chittagong Hill Tracts, Noakhali border, you will find that there are few smattering of settlements of Rakhine people. And actually Rakhines, my spouse's father happens to be Rakhine, by the way, but they're Bangladeshi Rakhines, not Burmese Rakhines. And they had settled for centuries when the Bengali-speaking people did not like forests. That's why they were not there in the hill tracts at all, zero, until 1800s. But they came for trade. Now in the coastal areas, they were not there either because they were Rakhine people. But most of the Rakhine people have left for Burma now. But there's a smattering of settlements still, and they are suffering lots and lots of the lands, that Buddhist temples being taken over, the lands grabbed, and that's a common story. Anyway, so even if you go with the different definition of indigenous people, if not definition, understanding, if you don't have to be there for 5,000 years or 25,000 or 30,000 years, like in Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas. The question is, the indigenous were there before anybody else, because everybody comes from this earth. Nobody comes from Mars or Saturn to Earth. So in that case, everybody is, has some root somewhere. But the fact is, what were the first settlements? So I say that if they say that New Zealand and Australia are indigenous, North and South America are indigenous, and we are not, I would say that discriminatory. I've written about it because the only difference is that our occupiers, colonizers, did not come from beyond the seas, and their skin color and ours is similar, and we look similar. But they are still the settlers, and we are the indigenous. Next, please. Okay, I'll try to speed up. I think 12 minutes are gone. 3 more minutes. If you'll, I'll try to finish it quickly. Okay, now this is just giving you an idea of my ancestors' territory, how much it was, even up to the British days, right up to near the Dhaka highway of Chittagong city. Some of the Chakma people said their ancestors did shifting cultivation. Next, please. On the Chittagong airport, where you find the tea, and there were Tripura and Chakma there. Don't find them. It's all metal roads and buildings now. Next, please. Well, Madhuburgar, my mother's sister's husband was an agriculture. He was posted there in Madhupur, 1960s. It was full of, jungle. It was very few roads and cities and towns and all that. Next. Okay. No, so I've told you about the current status. There is a fair bit of literature from the northwest, where your Santal Munda lives, central Madhupur, Garo and Hajong, northeast Sylhet, the Khasi, and other peoples. Southeast Sundarban I've talked about, south coastal area of the Rakhines I've told you about, southeast Chittagong hill tracts. I'll come to the hill tracts now. Next, please. Okay, so this is just comparing the hill tracts agreement with many other similar agreements, Panglong in Myanmar, with the northeast tribes, Mizo Naga in northeast India, then Indonesia with West Papua. I do not have Bangla Samoro, but that should be maybe an interesting thing to say. There are some good things for the Bangsamoro agreement that could actually help guide us and others. Next, please. Okay, so the CHT Accord is, I sometimes call it the waging of peace by the security force in the state. What war? They are waging it, but they call it peace. You can understand what that means. Next. And so from military takeover of lands to civil and military complicity in patronizing settlers, land grabbing, sale of land by impoverished IPs. If you have nothing else to do, you sell your land, even your home or your farmland. Increased deforestation in the forest reserves as we speak. Next week, I am associated with the Bangladesh Indigenous Peoples Network on biodiversity and climate change. We're going to file a case in the Supreme Court against logging in the southern Sangu Reserve, which is very next to Rakhine State bordering. And last year, our colleagues from Adivasi Forum and Kapaeeng Foundation did a similar thing in the High Court on the rocks, stones, and boulders from Bandarban. So anyway, we'll go to the High Court and see what happens. So new roads are coming. It is being resisted. People have died. People have been jailed for resisting these so-called new roads. But one little bit of good thing is that the World Bank wanted to make a road to the border, and Kapaeeng Foundation, Paul, myself, and a few others, we worked together to stop. And thankfully, the World Bank said no, because we showed them that they violated their own indigenous people's policies. So World Bank is off, but that doesn't mean the road is off. So we don't know. Next. Regarding territorialization, you know, these laws are the thing. I'll try to summarize it. It's like in Northeast India, we had inner land regulation in some parts that no non-tribal, non-Indigenous could enter the territory except government forces. Our law was also there. It's called Rule 452. That law was never repealed, but still it was put into a cold storage. So now they are coming. And regarding territory, you know, there was this road to Sajek near Mizoram border. There people, at least one person gave up his life. His name is Ladu Moni. So the market name after him, he was killed. But so they resisted to an extent successfully the coming of settlers. They couldn't stop the road because the security forces are there, but they have. So there are some. But at the moment, it's the Mro people who are struggling to defend their ancestral domain against a takeover hotel with a Bangladeshi private company. I don't know, Marriott Hotel is involved, and a security force agency is supposed to be also a part of this. But the Mro people are resisting, and I think they have all of the democratic people behind them, including non-indigenous people in Dhaka and all the indigenous peoples in Bangladesh, CST. But of course, you do have, you know, politics, money, and all that, and strength. You know, they are being oppressed. We don't know what's happening. Any day, people are being threatened every day, including yesterday, for resisting the land. Anyway, the frontier areas are losing their remoteness, which means that they are our last swathes of territories but until today, we are still the majority, because the plains people do not like to climb hills. So we have these more muscly calves given by our ancestors, like you do in the Cordilleras. So it makes it easier for us to go up the hills. I'm going to do that today too, for a function. But people are resisting. But the thing is, I don't know. They're also resisting and protecting our forests. We have an association of Village Common Forest, Association of Headman and Women Carbaris Network. These are trying to protect our forests and our water bodies. Okay, I'll go very fast. I think I'm almost at the end. Next, please. So the De-Territorialized Plains, I'm going back again to the plains. Northwest Barren Tract, I told you about the pioneering cultivators. They are pauperized. Madhupur, the forest is shrinking, and indigenous people, many of them have moved away to India in Meghalaya. Same with Sylhet. Unfortunately, that's not only the indigenous, it's not only companies and the forest department which claims indigenous lands. There are also private tea companies which are protected by special laws, and where, if you're a tea worker, many of them are of indigenous descent, some of them from India, you earn even less than labor wage than you do in the average market. And the pitiful education status. Sundarbans, indigenous, are hugely marginalized, but some of them are still there. And South Coastal Rakhine, I think if you ask a lot of Rakhine people, the looming question is, when shall we leave for Rakhine State? I think they've been doing that. They are not even 1/20th of what they used to be from the turn of the century. So that's a sort of very troubling. Next, please. Okay, I told you about some happy things on the left. I said there are more women at village chief traditional leadership. But of course, we have our majoritarianism and we have a patriarchy, even within our societies, which we are trying to struggle with. Now, the mandatory consultation of indigenous peoples in land management, that's a good thing. We have actually, particularly through the recognition of the tribal institutions, traditional institutions in Chittagong tracts, but not in the plains. Now, customary law and procedure are recognized. In fact, this is probably one of the strongest elements of the CHT laws, which doesn't define what customary law is, but it recognizes customary law, meaning that who defines customary law? Obviously, the custodians of customary law define. It's not the president of Bangladesh or the chief justice or the prime minister or parliament or bureaucrats. If it's customary law, then we are the custodians, we define. So that is a good way with which to sort of resist. And that is one of the few spheres where I think the situation is not so asymmetrical between the state or the market and the indigenous, because we tell you what is customary law, that is recognized. Next, please. Okay, so the remoteness still protects us, as I said. Then we have the spirit of self-determination and resistance still going. So on the Jumma side of it, indigenous side of it, the government may not have followed their points of the agreement, but we are holding on to our self-determination to the extent necessary. It's rugged, so people can't go. We have a lot of, I'm calling it indigenous camaraderie. So the indigenous to indigenous relations, we are one, as I think is demonstrated in many things, including in this Mro people's issue. The CHT Accord, and of course, UNDRIP has been a force in uniting us and making us fight for our rights. When I say fight, I'm not meaning fighting with guns, I'm meaning fighting constitutionally. But it is not for me to comment whether if you do it with a gun, it's good or bad. I do not have any comments. But for me, I'm talking about constitutional and peaceful movements, long history and traditional resistance to colonization. But then my ancestors actually took up guns to fight the British when they first came in 1770s. Next, please. I think, well, that's it. Those are some, one man and three women, I think. I don't know, it's two. On a shifting Sweden field in Bandarban, and I think you can see the elder sister, cousin, arranging the turban, the headdress of the young girl. Anyway, so that's it for me, and I think we are still fighting. We'll keep on fighting, and we appreciate our support from our indigenous sisters and brothers from the Philippines, Cordillera, and elsewhere in Asia and everywhere. So let's get on with defending our territories and lands, and as you guys in the Philippines say, ancestral domains. Thanks a lot.
Thank
and
you.
apologies if I can't stay for long after this. I'll try to stay for another 15, 20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was truly educational, and we also got a bit of history lesson. So indeed, just like in other parts of the world, the indigenous peoples of Bangladesh live under constant threat of being evicted from their own lands. And it is interesting, actually, even though we just caught a glimpse of it, how you compared it to similar accords in the region between governments and indigenous peoples. But what I am able to draw from this is that even with the existence of such agreements that is beautifully written, from the CHT Accord, the one with Papua for Northeast India and in the states of Burma, there's still rampant violations of land rights. And even contrary to the name of the peace accord, of some agreements that contain the word peace of it, there is still no peace or justice for many indigenous peoples, as interests for profit trump over the people's rights, and it dominates the concept of development for many states. So before we proceed to our next speaker, we are going to have a cultural performance first. So this is a traditional Chakma song called Uton Pege Mege. All right. Again, that was Uton Pegemege, a Shakma song. If I understood from our conversation earlier with Miss Chanchana, it is about the wanting of the heart to fly freely. So, before we proceed to our next speaker, we actually already have questions and answers submitted by some of our Zoom participants in the Q&A box. So, if I may request our panelists, as we understand that some will have to leave earlier due to other engagements, that you can actually type your answers and respond to the Q&A directly. Also, so that we can accommodate more questions later on in the open forum. So again, to our panelists, you may respond directly to the Q&A there. All right. Okay. So we have heard about the general indigenous peoples movement from our last two speakers, but now we cannot speak of the people's movement without also going to the women's, hearing the voice of the women too. So yesterday we commemorated the International Day to End Violence Against Women. And it's only right that we also hear from the indigenous women's movement in Bangladesh, who also hold the line in forwarding the indigenous people's right to land and life in the country. So for our last presenter, we have Ms. Chanchana Chakma, a human rights activist and a member of the PCJSS, a political organization of the Juma people of the Chittagong Hill Tracts. So Ms. Chanchana, over to you. Jana, you may begin your presentation.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. Thank you very much, Dewa. I'm very great to be here. Yes, yeah, from yesterday to 25 December to 25 November to 10 December, it's International Day of the Elimination Violence Against Women, and it's very important for us to ending violence against women. I want to say the violence against ending the violence against indigenous women. My presentation is a specific violence against indigenous women and girls in Bangladesh. Here is just Shonjib already mentioned how many indigenous people in Bangladesh, and he said more than 50. I write here more than 55, over 55 indigenous ethnic community, approximate 1.6 total population of Bangladesh. And that Sonjib also mentioned the sponsored by the government transmission migration in Chittagong Hill Tracks 1979 to is still going on. We call the settler Bengali, and they have occupied the indigenous land in Chittagong Hill Tracts. Actually, and also government didn't recognize as indigenous people. Still, we are fighting for the recognized as indigenous people in Bangladesh. Here, indigenous women, actually most of the indigenous women, they are living in rural area, remote area, most of disadvantaged and vulnerable in terms of the socio-economic status. Indigenous women are facing like multiple forms of discrimination, like because of their sex, race, and ethnicity, language, culture, religious, and class, and also economy and wages. And indigenous women voice are not included in government policies and legislation. And a specific example, the National Women Development Policy, we have dialogue with the government policy maker, but they didn't consult with us to when they adopted the women policy. We have only one clause, which is disadvantaged women, like development disadvantaged women, but they didn't recognize as indigenous women there. Violence against indigenous women, here we have recorded actually Kapaeeng Foundation every year. They publish the human rights report. I write from there 2007 to 2019, 612 reported incident of between 13 years, and 33 reported incident. One is January this year, 2019, in 12 in CST and 14 in plainland. Most cases are sexual violence. Most victims are the children and girls. And here I give you rape, gang rape, and rape, murder, shot death, and physical assault, molestation, attempt to rape, kidnap, and sexual harassment, trafficking. Indigenous women are most are the having the trafficking and rape and gang rape in Chittagong Hill Tracts. During the pandemic situation, also the increasing the indigenous women, violence against indigenous women in Chittagong Hill Tracts and plainland. This picture is actually which have been killed after rape in Kagratchuri, Chittagong Hill Tracts. She is 5th grade, and she was gang raped in Chittagong Hill Tracts, but perpetrator didn't punish. Still, he is out of the punishment. And this is I put here in September 2020, only within 1 month, 11 incidents of violence against indigenous women and girls, including rape, gang rape, sexual harassment, and abduction. In this incident, 11 incident women and adolescents have been victims of violence. Among them, 7 women and girls have been raped, including 2 gang rapes, and 4 women have been sexually harassed, beaten, and abducted. The most the shocking of the brutal of this incident was the gang rape of mentally challenged Jumo women by 9 Bengali settlers in Kagratchuri. and the looting of their valuable things in the house. It's really shocking. He was disabled, mentally challenged. He have been raped, gang rape, and this out of 9, 8 persons have been arrested, but we are worrying about the running of case because of economic problem and also system problem in Chittagong Hill Tracts, because in Chittagong Hill Tracts is systematic domination is still going on from the Pakistan period to till. Here is violence against indigenous women, injustice, especially in Chittagong Hill Tracts. 0 cases in prosecuted in CST since established the formal code in 2008, and only one we can say verdict for a gang rape in murder case of the Plain Land 2013. And this year 100% of perpetrator are the Bengali people and CST people we call Chattagram, and Plain Land also who are the perpetrator, they are Bengali people. And here violence against indigenous women problem. Why? Because of impunity of perpetrator and the plural system in Chittagong Hill Tracts we have, but violence against women case, domestic violence, our traditional institute they have system, but violence against women directly we can police station and court. And another one is the lack of the legal awareness and complex of the court procedure, and Chittagong Hill Tracts especially here I mentioned the base of corruption and evidence. If any cases, if we want to win, and we need the proper evidence, but sometimes in medical evidence, medical report have been corrupted by the doctor, and some system also because of the system corrupted, and lack of systematic documents and monitoring violence against women case, especially if indigenous women have been raped. That case is not like running continuous, sometimes lack of monitoring, that is the problem. CST Accord non-implement, due to the non-implement CST Accord, indigenous women are having a lot of problem like violence against women and other problem also in Chittagong Hill Tracts, because there are multiple administration system. Then one of the most they are the military system and other things also. Here, I mentioned the employment. During the pandemic situation, who are the migrant from Chittagong Hill Tracts to city level, like garments worker, then others in Plain Land, beauty parlor worker, they have lost their work. And also still in remote area versus discrimination when working as a day labor, indigenous women. Education, I escaped this. Health actually is very important for indigenous women. During the pandemic situation, indigenous women have been facing a lot of problems. Like some are they cannot reach their hospital. One of the, for example, in Subulong, one of the indigenous women from remote area, they are coming to the Rangamati Shodor Hospital. That time she cannot reach the hospital because of 2 hours in the middle of the road. Military people stop her and asking a lot of problem, because during the pandemic situation they cannot allow to come there, but she has died on the way. It's very crucial for the indigenous women, and also no segregated data available for indigenous women, and also indigenous people in Chittagong Hill Tracts and Plain Land. And maternal mortality rate is in Chittagong Hill Tracts was 2 or 3 times higher than the national average, which is one of the highest South Asia. This is reported by UNDP research. Political participation. Actually, indigenous women, no representative from of the indigenous women in national parliament. No reserve seat, 50 reserve seat for women out of the 350 seat, but for indigenous women, no reserve seat. Even no reserve seat for indigenous women in the local government bodies. But in Chittagong Hill Tracts, some indigenous women are having elected, but this is not actually, we have no especially reserve seat for indigenous women. Indigenous women's laws and policies in Bangladesh. I mentioned before the National Women Development Policy of 2011 in Bangladesh. They categorized as a backward and a small ethnic group, but only one columns. We demand for the disabled person have one full of chapter, but for indigenous women actually no have chapter, only 2 lines. Here they mention the backward and a small ethnic group, not consultant. Also, when they have formulated, they didn't consult with the indigenous women. We have dialogue, but they didn't consult. I mentioned it, and here, okay. This is I think you can see the photo, which is the in the recent issues of Moreland graphing by the Marriott Hotel and 5-star hotel. This is the one of the 4 example. Before 2018, they have lost their land occupied by the multinational company and military. They have lost their land. That's why they are cross the border, and in the Myanmar border, they are going there. Some this is one of the most vulnerable of the indigenous people for the tourism. Tourism is spot in is called Sajak Valley, and hundreds of indigenous people, hundreds of family indigenous people, they have lost their land for this tourism, and more than vulnerable for indigenous women and girls here, because they have lost, they have no income source, they have broke their backbone of income source. That's why some are become vulnerable, some are become like prostitutes, and it's very crucial for the indigenous women in Chittagong Hill Tracts. And here is more people are migrating in Myanmar. This is one of the happen in Longgudu. They are also one of all women have been die for because she didn't come out from the house. The communal attack, the arson attack of indigenous women village community is called my district. My district Rangamati sub district name is Longgudu. Actually, we Bangladesh indigenous people and indigenous women, we want to live with our dignity. We want our dignity. This is some recommendation. I will not read it because. Okay, thank you very much. We have to keep play our role, and you have to play your role to ending violence against indigenous women and violence against women. And also we have resource our community. We have to awareness of community for violence against women, violence against indigenous women all over the world. Thank you all of you who are the listener and participant and the panelists.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Chanchana Chakma. Indeed, we saw many layers of oppression for being an indigenous woman. and especially if you also belong to the working class. So they are disadvantaged in different aspects, both economically, politically, and even culturally. So especially your narratives on the incidents of sexual violence against women and girls, we believe it is really an urgent matter that needs urgent solidarity and action from the international community. And it is absurd that this has been allowed to go on for a very long time and even perpetrated by the state itself. So we definitely support your recommendation as this responds to the needs of the indigenous women in Bangladesh. So we have gathered a few questions. We'll get straight to it. Since Raja Dev has already left the Zoom room for another meeting, we would like to invite Mr. Palab, Mr. Sanjeev, and Shanchana to answer the questions. If Rajadev is still able to, he can also answer the question. So if you would allow me to rephrase some of them, we'll start with a question from NK Kenny of Northeast India. Does the customary law, I assume in the Chittagong Hill Tract, provide protection for women and children? And how do we ensure access to justice for the peoples in both customary and the national laws? So maybe we'll take it first from Rajadev, if you are still able to answer. If not, then we'll have Mr. Sanjeev answer it.
Yeah, I'm here actually for a little while. So, sorry, can you free? I was trying to answer some of the I did from Nepal, but I missed the others. Yes, can you repeat, please? Sorry.
The question is, does the customary law provide protection for women and children in CHT? How do we ensure access to justice for the indigenous peoples in both the customary and the national laws?
There are two types of customary law, amongst others, not remembering procedure. One is customary personal law, family law, inheritance, marriage, divorce, child custody. The other is customary land and forest law. The land one is weaker, but it's still not zero here. And with the personal law too, we are struggling as we speak for every day and all, how to we ensure more equitable rights as between men and women for like inheritance of land and so forth, their status in whole. So I would say that customary law in some cases can be a minus, but in most cases it is a plus. Because as I said, customary law means people made law. Statutes are government or parliament made law. The women here are closer to the traditional institutions in our district and regional councils than they are to the parliament and government in Dhaka. We have only 4 indigenous MPs out of 300 and however many. So I think they stand a better chance within the by invoking and making use of customary law, which you cannot find in many statutory laws, but customary law is recognized by statute. That mind you, we do have patriarchy even within our society. So the bigger challenge is actually how do we be more respectful of women's rights? How can we be non-discriminatory towards women? And in this, we need to fight both men and particularly women with patriarchal attitudes can be even a stronger deterring force. So if we get together, I think we can use customary law for the indigenous peoples on a whole and for indigenous women and girls as well.
Thank you very much, Rajadev. So I would ask now Mr. Sanjeev if you have anything to add to that, or our other panelists, Ms. Chanchana and Mr. Palab. So if none, we will. Mr. Sanjeev.
Yeah. Just I was seeing a question from Kamal about indigeneity. I think indigeneity or Adivasi, what do you call it? Adivasi-ness, maybe. This is I think, fundamental issue for us, indigenous peoples. It has a historical, what do you call, background, and it makes us strong that we have the fundamental rights to our land and territory, our motherland. Because of the modern state, I think this was uh, not recognized in that way. So, like in Bangladesh, government recognized indigeneity or indigenous peoples. Even still, there are many documents we see that government document even that indigenous peoples uh, are recognized. But how we can put this on the table? I think is a big question. We should continue our struggle, continue to push this, and continue for engaging dialogue with government and policymakers, and maybe in future one day sensitive government or pro-indigenous government may come, and then I think these indigenous peoples indigeneity or their rights to uh, their land, territories, or even political rights might be achieved. Thank
Okay.
you.
Mr. Sanjeev, the question that just to clarify to our viewers, the question that Mr. Sanjeev answered is one of the question that ask what are the steps we can take to promote indigenous people's right and to preserve the indigeneity. So I understand that might be the important culture and the identities of indigenous peoples. So I think Raja Dev also wants to add to this.
Sorry, I was writing. Diva, can you please rephrase the question very quickly?
Okay, I rephrase the question to what do you think are the steps we can take to promote indigenous people's rights and the preservation of important cultures and identities?
Uh, I think first, I think we really have to sort of go through this inner self-discovery that we have answers to many of the questions, the problems we face today by looking at indigenous history. Like number one, I think identity. If we lose our sense of identity, which means our costumes, our cuisine, our games, our music, our dance, and much, much, even more importantly, our
Raja, we
self-help tradition, Malaya. It means a villager called the entire village to come and help her or him, especially her widows, to construct the house, repair the house, do the harvest. So in being indigenous means sharing your wealth, your time, your energy, your labor with others. So I think that's the number one thing. Of course, we do not have the market economies as not ours, the television and radio and information media is not ours, but we should be going for, I think, more and more strategic alliances with progressive sections of mainstream non-indigenous society, where then we can tilt the balance a little bit at the asymmetry between us and the market and the state, and then but also our job is to show win-win situations as how supporting indigenous is also supporting the entire state and mainstream society. There lies the rub, and there lies the challenge of, if you like, I don't know, demythologizing, our customs and tradition and trying to place them. You can't translate them, but place them in a way that non-indigenous people understand. Just like I told you about Malaya, that is a tradition of all indigenous peoples everywhere in the world. But we are losing it if we live in the cities. So with all this, I think we take pride in it. When ambassadors come to visit us, I serve indigenous food, 100%. They eat it. So if we take pride in our own things, we continue to do it, then first we retain our identity, then we do the strategy and our networking and alliances, how to we retain our identity and assert our nationness, our peopleness.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sanjeev and Raja Dev. Agreed, no, that the indigenous people struggle, the issues is not solely the responsibility of indigenous peoples. That is why we have indigenous people supporters and advocates who are just as passionate in when it comes to defense of ancestral lands, preservation of cultures and identities. So, all right, moving on to our next question. This one came from Facebook, and I would address this to Mr. Palab Shakma, if you are here. The question is, how do you describe the situation of indigenous peoples in Bangladesh in this time of the pandemic? So in terms of access to socioeconomic assistance and also the political situation for human rights, on human rights.
Uh, if we describe the situation of indigenous people in this pandemic, actually, at the very beginning, people suffered a lot because there was when the government imposed a restriction of movement, and also the closure of local markets, and also when all the working places are shut down due to the lockdown. So migrant workers who were working in towns, they were forced to return to their home. But on the way back, they suffered a lot because there was no available vehicles. They were walking for hours and hours. So, and also at the some points, the local security forces also created bar on their way back to home. So all this struggle, they face all these challenges. But arriving at home, then they face food shortage. And initially, the community people also mobilized some their local resources, and government also provided some relief. But unfortunately, due to the remoteness of the territory, indigenous people were almost out of the most of the indigenous regions. People didn't get the government relief. So on the other hand, the farmers who usually grow crops, and also they were practicing orchard gardening, so they were unable to sell their produce at the market because the market was closed. And so this is how they face challenges. On the other hand, the thousands of migrant workers who used to work at city, they're forced to return back to their home, and after returning home, uh, they didn't have their earnings. So still now, a majority of those home return migrant workers are without work. They are suffering, and also the women who used to work at different beauty parlors, because indigenous Garo women actually dominant at the beauty parlors in the beauty industry in the city. So they were also forced to leave their workplace because they all closed. So and also the education system, if you mention during the pandemic, till now all education institutions are closed. So no, only few universities, they are conducting remote education, but majority of the institutions are remain closed. But even in this situation, some universities are conducting their digital teaching. But indigenous people, due to the digital divide, so indigenous people or students who are not able to afford their laptops, internet facilities, and all the indigenous territories or indigenous regions are not well covered with electricity connection. So indigenous students are far behind or left behind in this digital education platform. So overall, till now, the small business, small entrepreneurs from the indigenous people, community, they are suffering a lot because they are not getting subsidies, or they are not included in the government package. As government declare some package programs for small entrepreneurs, but indigenous peoples, indigenous small entrepreneurs are still left behind. So all these challenges are facing by the indigenous communities.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Palab. Those that you've enumerated is also shared experience among other communities in the world, actually, the loss of source of income, the lack of inadequate support from the government, and even the restriction of the movement that has, which we realize that is actually beneficial for the continued land grabbing and other political attacks and repression. So, okay, we will proceed to our last question, which we will address to Ms. Chanchana Chakma. So this is regarding your presentation on the use of rape as a weapon against IP women and girls. So how does the indigenous women in Bangladesh confront this multiple layer of exploitation and oppression with regard to the use of rape as to attack the indigenous women? Okay, Ms. Chanchana, you may answer.
Yes. Hello. Could you reply again the question?
How does the indigenous women's movement in Bangladesh confront this, the use of, handle the issue of the use of the state, the use of rape of the state to as a weapon against indigenous communities, especially against indigenous women and girls?
Thank you very much. Question. Actually, every struggle, like every freedom struggle and other struggle, and state used as a weapon of women, not only indigenous women, and here also like that in Bangladesh. State using the indigenous women as a weapon because if they want to destroy our existence or our ethnicity or identity, and they like violence against indigenous women because of if anyone land grabbing, then other struggle also. That time also indigenous women are facing like rape, gang rape, then attack or trafficking and kill after rape. That is the rule of the who are the dominant, who are the state government and the who are the dominator. They use that, and here also in Bangladesh, also in especially in Chittagong Hill Tracts, from the 70 Pakistan period to before Pakistan period and Pakistan period, it was the less violence against women, but from freedom. Liberation is still going on. We are struggling for our self-determination right in Chittagong Hill Tracts. That's why they use as a weapon the indigenous women. That's why they violence women, because if they destroy their dignity, and that's they have used the women. It's very crucial in Chittagong Hill Tracts when the we have 12 genocide in Chittagong Hill Tracts during our war. Like we have the agreement and CST accord, everyone know that. And before that, that time also women was have been raped, gang raped, kidnapped, and some are the forced marriages, and some are they have killed them. And during the genocide, also women was the more vulnerable. They used as a weapon in Chittagong Hill Tracts. Thank you. And also, rape case, I would like to mention why the not punishment the perpetrator, accused person, because of the cultural impunity. And another one is the evidence corruption, like medical report, then other report also sometimes have been corruption. And if indigenous women, and they have also difficult to run the case for the economy, then language and other problem also in Chittagong Hill Tracts. Thank you.
Thank you, Chanchana. It is true, no, that we really must pay attention to the women's movement if we are sincere on liberating not just a certain sector, but our entire peoples. So thank you again to everyone who sent in their questions. Due to time limit, we have to close now our open forum. Again, this program is part of an webinar series on educational series on South Asia, and we have plenty more opportunity to discuss in different platforms. We can also be reached through social media and email if you would like to forward your questions and comments later on. So to officially close our program, let us hear a summary of what we've learned from the last 2 hours or so, and more importantly, our ways forward from this discussion. So let us welcome Ms. Beverly Longid, the Global Coordinator of the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation, to synthesize our webinar. Beverly.
Thank you very much, Dio. And I would also like to thank the organizers, no, for holding this wonderful webinar. In fact, I think we had a very good and active discussion on Bangladesh. I myself have learned a lot from the discussions that our panelists have shared. I think one of the things that we have learned in this webinar is that indeed indigenous peoples, wherever we are, whether we are in Bangladesh, whether we are in Southeast Asia, Latin America, or in the Americas, in Europe, we share common problems, we share common histories, and we share common aspirations and struggles. I think one of the main things that has been highlighted in the past 2 hours is the issue of the non-recognition of indigenous peoples as indigenous peoples, and this in both in law and in practice. And this has resulted to what Sanjeev mentioned as unpeopling, or what Dev has mentioned as minoritization of indigenous peoples in their own lands, in their own territories. And this unpeopling and minoritization can also be traced in this aggressive and continuous land violation of land rights of the indigenous peoples of Bangladesh, both in the hills and both in the hills and in the plains. And non-recognition of land rights can be seen through land grabbing or the entry of different development projects, and now the aggressive entry of tourism, wherein building of hotels leads to displacement of several hundreds of indigenous families. And because of this violation of land rights, we also see now a shrinking of the territories of indigenous peoples that would lead to the further impoverishment of indigenous peoples. And in this case, wherein you have an increasing levels of poverty among indigenous peoples, some families are also forced to sell their lands, that leads to the further shrinking of land and territories. And it is also worrisome to hear that the phenomenon, or the growing the policy of the government of Bangladesh on population transfer. We've seen this in West Papua. If we hear most of this trend happening in West Papua, but it is only now that we see the increasing trend also in Bangladesh, wherein you have government sponsoring sponsoring settlers to intrude, no, into indigenous people's territories. And in this context, we are now able to see the strategy of government to divide and rule the people by using the settlers against indigenous peoples. Contributing to this minoritization or unpeopling is also criminalization of indigenous peoples' defenders, activists, or workers, and the continuing militarization of indigenous peoples' lands and territories. Um, it's also very alarming and sad to hear of the situation of indigenous women in Bangladesh. Like other indigenous women, indeed, we face multiple discrimination. And in the case of Bangladesh, this is a situation wherein we see government, um, uh, private corporations successfully using violence against women as a weapon of war or as a weapon to further what they call this uh, dispossess or to further minoritize not only women but the entire indigenous community. And it is also alarming that in many cases, these assault against women are not conducted only by state forces, but also in collusion with settlers, non-indigenous population. There's been an interesting discussion on customary law and the legal law or constitutional law, but it seems that this is something that we have to work for um, to address the issue of injustice and the growing impunity that leads to non-prosecution of cases against women and girls and against the indigenous peoples in general. But in terms of ways forward, it's also what they call this, inspiring that we see a growing solidarity among the different indigenous peoples in Bangladesh, not only in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, but also in the other areas or what we call the other plains in Bangladesh. And second, I would like to echo the point mentioned by Dev that there's also a need to to build strategic alliances with progressive sections of Bangladesh, the progressive sections of society, because indigenous peoples indeed would need also the support, the active support of non-indigenous peoples who would advocate for indigenous people's rights. On the part of indigenous peoples, or even on the part of advocates, there's also a need to well, Dev used the term demystify, but for me, probably to also do away with romanticization of indigenous people's culture, because indeed we need to further enhance our customary laws and traditions so that this would lead to uh, real, genuine protection for indigenous women and girls, and of course, for our land rights. And for this, we need to build a stronger indigenous peoples movement in Bangladesh and in the rest of the world. The third point that came out in all of the discussions, a way of recommendations, is how do we engage with government and how do we engage with changes or reforms in policies and reforms. And I believe, Sanjeev spoke strongly about this, of being able to maximize the small spaces that the government allows civil society, and that includes indigenous peoples, from having legal recognition on who are indigenous people's rights. But I think Palab also mentioned that while we do engage in policy reforms and policy advocacy, behind this is a strong indigenous peoples movement that would push government to act on our demands and our calls. So it was really a very interesting discussion. We hope to have more online discussions, not only on the situation of Bangladesh, but probably in the other parts of South Asia. We forgot to mention earlier that this specific webinar on Bangladesh is part of a month-long education series on people's resistance in South Asia that we are also co-organizing with the International League of People's Struggles, specifically its chapter for Asia and Pacific. So this will not be the last, this will not be the first, nor the last webinar that we'll be having on Bangladesh and on the other countries of South Asia. And we hope to have a longer discussion on to further expound on these issues. So again, Thank you very much to our panelists. Very, very good presentations. Thank you very much to our organizers, especially to my colleagues in the IPM SDL who really worked hard in making sure that we have a successful webinar. So again, long live the indigenous peoples, long live the indigenous peoples of Bangladesh, long live international solidarity. Thank you.
Can I say a few words, Beverly?
And that's a wrap. We'll see you again on the next part of the education series. Oh, Sanjeev wants to give a closing statement. All right.
Yeah, Diwa, yeah. Beverly, thank you so much. You have covered almost everything very nicely. Just one thing I can say, that our solidarity, our support among each other is very, very important. And I think this should be strengthened, our network, our support each other. And finally, I am still strong enough and still courageous to say that in this kind of political regime, like where you face, like there is almost big problem with good governance, big issue, lack of transparency, lack of what you call rule of law, and high level of corruption. In this kind of situation, indigenous peoples have to fight. I don't know how long, but I think we will continue our fight and we will make our solidarity stronger. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mr. Sanjeev. So Chanchana, would you also like to give a closing statement?
Thank you. Long live solidarity, international solidarity. Thank you very much for being part of this with Bangladesh. And you have solidarity with us. Thank you very much. We will be continue each other.
Right. So thank you everyone, to our speakers and everyone who is joining us here in Zoom and on Facebook, our technical team, and of course our partner organizations who made this forum possible. So long live international solidarity, and see you again in our next webinars. So keep in touch through email and social media. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Chanchan.
See you, Sanjeev, Palab, Chanchana.
Yes, see you. Bye-bye. See you.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Yeah. Hope to see you again.
Yes,
somewhere.
yes. Hopefully when COVID gets better, we get to visit the hills and plains of Bangladesh.